Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. Thank you. That feels a lot better. My name is Dorian Llewellyn. I am the Executive Director of the Ignatian Center for Jesuit Education at Santa Clara University, and I'm also the university's Mission and Identity Officer. So my role this afternoon is really to say one word, which is welcome, but here are a few other words as well. So I want to extend a welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Susanna Cornwell, and also to Father Bill O'Neill from the Jesuit School of Theology, who will be speaking today. I'd also like to particularly offer a warm welcome to Bishop McGrath, who has joined us this afternoon as our guest, and also especially so to our students, our faculty, and our staff, and the wider university community and outside guests. It is, I think, an understatement to say that we live in divided and dividing times. In such times, a university has a particular role to play. We are a community of intellectual inquiry, and we are, on this campus, people who hold radically different views one from another. Now, we talk an awful lot in academia about diversity, which includes, of course, ethnic and also cultural and economic and gender diversity. But it also includes religious diversity and ideological and intellectual diversity, which is another word for people who disagree with each other. But we do this as a community. That word community and conversation are not only things that we do, but they are also our values as well. And they both have in common, those two words, a word in Latin which means with or together. So conversation does not necessarily result in consensus, but hopefully what it does result is a deeper understanding and appreciation of the people who are diverse from us. One of the great values of American culture is religious freedom. Intellectual freedom is a prerequisite for a university to be a university. Now, as a Catholic university, Santa Clara has a particular role. It is to be a Catholic university, that is, to exemplify and activate the values of Catholic Christianity. But at the same time, it is also a Catholic university. That is, we exist ultimately to serve the people of God and the peoples of the world through with intellectual inquiry, which is attentive, intelligent, reasonable, responsible, and loving. Those two aspects exist in tension with each other, and it's often quite difficult to balance them because the tension is constant, delicate, and sensitive. But that is where we live. That is who we are. That is what we do. And for that, we cannot depend only on our own abilities to do it well. So, with that in mind, I would like to invite you all to pray with me. Holy and living God, Trinity of persons and unity of being, we gather together today as a community, different in our passions, our convictions, and our allegiances. We ask you for the grace to listen deeply so that you may teach us how to be one. Help us to seek your truth at all times and all circumstances. Open our eyes to recognize you present in each human life, but especially in the most vulnerable, the poor, and the stranger. We call to mind this afternoon especially those who have died and who have lost their homes in the fires in Napa and Sonoma. In the fragile diversities of this world that you have created and that you hold in being, please reveal to us your changeless beauty. We ask this in the Holy Spirit through Christ our Lord. Amen. Holy Mother of God, seat of wisdom, pray for us. So I would now like to go and sit down and hand over the rest of, and enjoy the rest of today's program. I'm handing it over to Teresa Ladrigan-Welpley. Dr. Ladrigan-Welpley is director of the Bannon Institutes, which is one of the heritage programs of the Ignatian Center. And this afternoon is all entirely the result of her careful and loving diligence. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. and welcome. As Father Dorian mentioned, it's my privilege to serve as the director of the Bannon Institutes and Ignatian Spirituality and the Ignatian Center, which seeks to exemplify and activate the Jesuit Catholic character of our university through dialogue, reflection, and action. And as many of you are aware, the Ignatian Center's Bannon Institute regularly hosts interdisciplinary faculty collaboratives and a podcast series, lectures, and roundtables such as this afternoon. Our present Bannon Institute is framed around the question and call, is there a common good in our common home? A summons to solidarity. In the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, Pope Paul VI defined the common good as the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment. The Catholic religious tradition has a long history of acknowledging the complexity and incompleteness of this pursuit of the common good, even as it seeks to advance it. Just steps away from defining the common good in this way in Gaudium et Spes, Pope Paul VI reflects, with respect to the fundamental rights of the person, every type of discrimination, whether social or cultural, whether based on sex, race, color, social condition, language, or religion, is to be overcome and eradicated as contrary to God's intent. For in truth, it must still be regretted that fundamental personal rights are still not being universally honored. Noted Catholic social ethicist Lisa Soul Cahill, a proud graduate of Santa Clara, asks pointedly if Christian notions of the common good, human dignity, and the resultant human rights have yielded a sex and gender ethics which can be understood as social ethics. She asks, has Christian teaching and practice about sex, gender, marriage, and family enhanced appreciation of all persons' common humanity, the value of each, the interdependence of all? Has it led to the construction of ecclesial and social institutions which give such appreciation, stability, and material expression? Her conclusion is that Christianity has, on these issues, a mixed record. Indeed, issues of sex and gender remain central and contested issues within Catholic social ethics today. In recent years, for his part, Pope Francis has reflected on his own pastoral accompaniment of transgender persons. In one of his famous airplane interviews last year, he remarked, "We must be attentive, not saying all are the same. Every case, welcome it, accompany it, study it, discerning and integrating. This is what Jesus would do today." However, just as explicitly and consistently, including earlier this month, Pope Francis has underlined the significance of essential, divinely ordered differences between the sexes, condemning what he terms the ideological colonization of gender theory that does not recognize the order of creation. He commented, "I wonder if so-called gender theory may not be an expression of frustration and resignation that aims to erase sexual differentiation because it no longer knows how to come to terms with it. Does a theological anthropology marked by gender complementarity and contemporary frameworks of sex and gender ethics afford individuals and whole communities thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment? How might we continue to discern and enact pastoral responses with transgender and intersex persons in our communities today?" We're grateful to enter these questions this afternoon with Professor Susanna Cornwall, Advanced Research Fellow in Theology and Religion at the University of Exeter in the UK, and Director of the Exeter Center for Ethics and Practical Theology. She is the author or editor of several books, including Intersex, Theology and the Bible, Troubling Bodies in Church, Text, and Society, Thinking Again About Marriage, Key Theological Questions, Controversies in Queer Theology, and Theology and Sexuality. Her newest monograph, out just this year, is titled Unfamiliar Theology: Reconceiving Sex, Reproduction, and Generativity. Her current research project at the West of England NHS Specialist Gender Identity Clinic explores spiritual care pathways for people undergoing gender transition in the National Health Service in England. We're delighted to welcome Professor Cornwall today to offer our 2017 Santa Clara lecture entitled Gender Justice and the Common Good: Discerning Spiritual Care Pathways with Transgender and Intersex Persons. Following Professor Cornwall's lecture, Father Bill O'Neill of the Society of Jesus, Associate Professor of Christian Ethics at the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara, and Bannon Institute Scholar in the Racial and Ethnic Justice Faculty Collaborative, will join Professor Cornwall for a brief response and dialogue before we open up the conversation to all of us with our questions. Father O'Neill's research addresses questions of human rights, ethics, social reconciliation, and conflict resolution. He serves as Catholic chaplain at the Federal Women's Prison in Dublin, California, and is a member of the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue, which should serve him well today. Throughout the lecture and response, we invite you to submit your questions on the index cards that were provided to you as you entered and checked in. And we'll be collecting these throughout the event, and we'll address them following Father O'Neill's response. But for now, please join me in warmly welcoming our 2017 Santa Clara lecturer, Professor Susanna Cornwall.
Thank you very much, Dorian and Teresa, for those really kind words of welcome. And thank you to all of you and to the administration of the university for inviting me here. So in the United Kingdom, where I live and where I work, the National Health Service, or NHS, is the primary provider of preventative and therapeutic healthcare for 65 million citizens. NHS care is free at the point of need. It's not means tested. It's funded by taxes and central government. The NHS provides general practitioners, specialist consultants, hospital doctors, surgeons and nurses, community nurses, midwives, pharmacists, paramedics, counsellors, mental health services, contraception and sexual health services, all free at the point of delivery. Across the UK, it includes free medication on prescription for under 18s, over 60s, pregnant women and new mothers, some people with disabilities, and people in receipt of social security benefits. All UK residents are eligible for NHS services. A leaflet distributed shortly prior to the launch of the NHS in 1948 spells out its vision, deeply rooted in the notion of a common good. It will provide you with all medical, dental, and nursing care. Everyone, rich or poor, man, woman, or child, can use it or any part of it. But it's not a charity. You're paying for it mainly as taxpayers, and it will relieve your money worries in times of illness. I'd like to play you a short audio recording of Aniran Bevin, the architect of the NHS, speaking, and this is taken from an exhibit at the People's History Museum in Manchester.
I'm proud about the National Health Service. It's a piece of real socialism. It's a piece of real Christianity too, you know. We had to wait a long time for it. What I had in mind when we organized the National Health Service in 1946 to 1958, and remember when we did it, you know, you younger ones, this is immediately after the end of the Second World War, when we were asked, Winston Churchill then said, a bankrupt nation. But nevertheless, we did these things. And there is nowhere in any nation in the world, communist or capitalist, any health service to compare with it. Now, the National Health Service had two main principles underlining it. One, that the medical arts of science and of healing should be made available to people when they needed them, irrespective of whether they could afford to pay for them or not. That was the first principle. The second was that this should be done not at the expense of the poorer members of the community, but of the well-to-do. In short, I refuse to accept the insurance principle. I refuse to accept the principle that the National Health Service should be paid by contributions. I refuse to accept that. I refuse to accept it because I thought it was nonsense. If you hadn't fully paid up, you couldn't have a second-class operation because your card wasn't full of stamps, could you?
So that, I think, is a really powerful vision of the common good. Not an uncontested one, not an unproblematic one, but a powerful one nonetheless, based in the conviction that healthcare shouldn't be a privilege of the deserving or the rich. From its inception, though, it's faced challenges. The population continues to grow, and under our current government, the NHS's budget continues to shrink. Nonetheless, within its remit is written into law and into the NHS's own contract of care that the provider must take account of the spiritual, religious, pastoral and cultural needs of all service users. So commissioning groups have had difficult decisions to make about the prioritisation of funds and about how to balance the goods and needs of individual patients with those of society as a whole. Is care for everyone simply too costly? How should different aspects of healthcare be prioritised? And in this lecture, I'll be considering the place of spiritual care, itself increasingly marginalised in the NHS, particularly for transgender people who might also be considered a niche or a marginal group. And I'll point to the necessity of affirming and compassionate theologies around transgender and also the emerging work of transgender Christians and their allies. And then later in the lecture, I move to considering how goods play out and how understandings of the common good play out in another area of gender medicine, that involving the decisions made around intersex children and their healthcare. And if terms like intersex and transgender are not familiar to you, please don't worry, we're going to unpack them as we go along. So first of all, what is transgender? It's a term some of you will be very familiar with, others less so perhaps. Transgender people experience a disjunction of some kind between their physical sex and their gender identity, that is, their sense of being a man or a woman. Some seek hormone therapy or various physical surgeries in order to bring their bodies more into line with their identity. Others, however, either because of choice or because of lack of access to funding for medical interventions, may live in their preferred gender without ever going through any physical alterations. In the UK, the average age for beginning gender transition is 42. And I think this is significant as by their 40s, most people are well established in their adult lives. They may well have spouses, children, and visible public roles in their communities. Transition is usually something they have considered long and hard. So weighing up goods in this context also means awareness of the possible challenges posed to others who felt invested in the lives and relationships with people who transition. And this is where I think some of the recent evangelical commentators on transgender, people like Mark Yarhouse, Vaughan Roberts, and Andrew Walker, are clearly motivated by compassion and concern for families and relations, but where I suspect they get the balance slightly wrong, because I think they're too unreflective about the harm that a narrow binary gender system does to all of us, not just to trans people. Theological responses to transgender, and I'm thinking of those particularly that have emerged since the last years of the 20th century, have sometimes focused on biblical texts, such as those from Deuteronomy and Leviticus, which outlaw, for example, women wearing men's apparel, offering animals with bruised or crushed testes as sacrifices, or admitting to the assembly of the Lord someone whose penis has been cut off. And I've discussed in more length elsewhere the fact that such texts appear to be as much about issues like disability and concerns about preserving the community by ensuring the continued possibility of procreation, as well as in terms of markers of inclusion such as male circumcision, as they are about sex per se. Furthermore, there is a counterstream within the biblical texts themselves, which point to a community in which those with torn, crushed, or excised genitals, notably eunuchs, are not excluded, but included as full members. We might point here to narratives such as Acts 8, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, baptized with no mention of his physical difference. Or Jesus' words about eunuchs from birth, those made eunuchs by others, and those who made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom in Matthew 19, which some interpreters understand as including present-day intersex and transgender people. And Isaiah 56, an example of a biblical pun, where we're told eunuchs will be given a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name which will not be cut off. Let the reader understand. Now, those who've had theological reservations about transgender have often started from the conviction that human bodies and identities, but especially bodies, have a certain givenness, an irreducibility, a directedness as created by God, and that therefore there are certain things, and only certain things, that it's legitimate to do to and be in them. So, for example, Oliver O'Donovan, the British evangelical ethicist, holds to know oneself as body is to know that there are only certain things that one can do and be, because one's freedom must be responsible to a given form, which is the form of one's own experience in the material world. Beyond this, there are also concerns about whether gender transition tends to lead to, or perhaps to mask, same-sex relationships, as well as the pastoral anxieties we've already mentioned about the effects of transition on family members of the transitioning person. O'Donovan, though, is particularly concerned about issues of illusion versus reality and the extent to which surgically created genitals may be understood as veritably human. Interestingly, though, O'Donovan, in common with some other theological interpreters, outlaws medical interventions for transgender people, but has no problem with them for intersex people, those who have an unusual physical sex. The argument here is that where physical sex is atypical, it is appropriate to clarify it, but that this is not true for gender identity. So physical sex is understood as the irreducible thing which must not be changed for transgender people, yet it is fine to alter it for intersex people, because I think of the assumption that intersex already represents a deviation from God's intention. However, those who rail against transgender interventions because they're unnatural may not feel so exercised about organ transplants, cochlear implants, laser eye surgery, prosthetic limbs, or a host of the ways that we intervene to augment our bodies, perhaps because we tend to understand sex and gender as somehow more fundamental than other aspects of our bodiliness. Yet, as I've argued at length elsewhere, the inconsistency in responses to transgender and to intersex suggests that something more is going on. While opponents to transgender intervention often hold that this is because human embodiment and animality are irreducible and shouldn't be eroded, often because of a good Christian commitment to concreteness, context, and incarnation, responses to intersex hint that there is something else underlying appeals to bodily integrity, and that bodies themselves may need to be brought into line with a more binary gendered than binary sexed assumption about what true, divinely intended human life actually looks like. But if binary gender is grounded in binary sex, what's the rationale for arguing that even people who do not have a clear binary sex must also have a clear binary gender? Significantly, though, it's not just critics of transgender who appeal to givenness. Many transgender people themselves also appeal to givenness, but in this case, the irreducibility of their gender identity, which they too often understand as divinely ordained. Several transgender Christians, including clergy, names such as Carol Stone, Rachel Mann, Sarah Jones, Justin Tannis, have written and spoken of the deep and intertwined relationship between their vocation to ordained ministry and their calling to live their lives in the gender they've always understood themselves to be. So Tannis, for example, says, "I look at my experiences of gender as the following of an invitation of God to participate in a new, whole, and healthy way of living in the world, a holy invitation to set out on a journey of transformation of body, mind, and spirit." Tannis writes powerfully of his understanding of gender as calling, not just for transgender people, but for everyone. And he notes that in common with other vocations, it may be revealed all at once or gradually over a long period. Rachel Mann acknowledges that her transition was, and I'm quoting her directly, an act of violence against the normal course of things. And yet, she says, without it, I would not have achieved the degree and depth of self-reconciliation that I have. Another theologian writing about transgender, Tricia Sheffield, has argued that Christ's body, as constructed in Chalcedonian belief, is somehow trans. It's simultaneously human and divine, and therefore it's polymorphous and transmutative, with both natures preserved. Since Christians believe in this body of Christ, as well as helping to constitute it, Christ's body might be a particularly important site of solidarity and hope for transgender people. Now, the work of some recent Christian writers, particularly evangelicals, in response to transgender, including Mark Yarhouse, Andrew Walker, that I've already mentioned, majors on gender dysphoria, that is the sense of alienation and exclusion from their bodies that many transgender people feel. And as a result, these theorists argue that the most therapeutic option for those transgender people will be to come to feel reconciled to their bodies, but without any surgical or hormonal intervention. There's thus far been less acknowledgement from that branch of the church that peace and reconciliation may come about through and not despite gender transition, and the broader recognition of one's identity by others, including one's faith community. So why spiritual care for transgender people? Well, pastoral and spiritual care for trans people might usefully be understood as accompaniment across all stages of their lives, before transition, during, and after any public gender transition. Such spiritual care might be an easy sell to those of us already invested in the place of faith and the supernatural in everyday life. However, in discussions about what should or could be provided by stretched healthcare systems, this aspect of the common good is not taken for granted. In a context like Britain, where more and more people identify as having no religion, it may seem like a niche interest for an already stretched health service. But more broadly, spirituality is understood as referring to the whole person, the package of their physical, emotional, mental, social well-being, particularly perhaps in the sense of belonging to something larger than that which we encounter in everyday life. And that could go regardless of whether or not someone adheres to a particular religious tradition. So if we're interested in negotiating goods and weighing up what constitutes the common good, we'll be interested both in what's good for communities as well as individuals, but also in what is commonly good for the different elements making up any given individual. So we might say giving space to spirituality in healthcare is giving space to acknowledgement that the person is a whole person, lives in a community network, and is more than the sum of their body parts. And I could point you to a host of research on healthcare chaplaincy which demonstrates the importance of spiritual well-being for mental and physical health. Theologians, including John Swinton, have emphasized the importance of emotion, feeling, intuition, and a sense of something beyond as central to processes of care, and have noted that a person's wider social and semantic context is not simply a backdrop to the real task of dealing with biological and psychological events which may be deemed pathological. Now, good healthcare providers know this. They know it already, and they do all they can to promote holistic well-being. But even the best, as we've heard, are working within overstretched systems and may find they simply have less time and fewer resources than they would like. That goes particularly in the UK context for those working in gender medicine. The NHS mandates a maximum 18-week waiting time for access to interventions, and yet the numbers of trans people being referred have spiralled so much in the last few years that the waiting list is now over 2 years in places. But anecdotal evidence suggests that a significant proportion of people seeking gender reassignment within the NHS in England do have a personal faith, and that their faith and spirituality are impacted by their gender incongruence and transition. And indeed, this has been corroborated by recent testimonies, for example, those of members of Sybil's transgender spirituality group who contributed to the collection This Is My Body, which came out a couple of years ago, or those of the Anglican priest and poet Rachel Mann, who I've already mentioned, who reflects profoundly on the interactions between her vocation to priesthood, her self-understanding as transgender, and her complicated relationship with a body which is subject to illness and pain as a result of digestive disorders that she has. Now, this may largely relate to factors external to the affected individual, but might also for some people be a feature of minority stress, and in particular internalized transphobia. However, for many people, spirituality and faith are important sources of support and identity as they undergo medical interventions and experience challenging life changes. However, some trans people have found it difficult to find religious communities where they can receive the support they need. Sometimes that's because of a suspicion within faith communities that transgender identity is either a rejection of a divine plan or simply evidence that something's gone wrong somewhere along the line. And such responses, which are often compassionate but nonetheless characterized by a deep investment in the fixity of human sex and gender, underlie work by Yarhouse, Walker and Roberts, which I've already mentioned. So they aim to protect trans people's families and communities, and they might therefore be said to uphold a common good. But I fear that it's one which subsumes the good of the trans minority to the apparent goods of a majority. And this both risks making trans people a kind of sacrificial scapegoat who must be sacrificed to shore up a shaky system, and I think does too little to interrogate whether a strongly binary system is actually bad for others, not just for trans people. Sometimes it takes an uncommon need for us to reevaluate our assumptions about what constitutes a common good. And sadly, religious communities have not always endorsed trans people's sense of being accepted as effectively as they might have done. And I want to suggest that this impoverishes these faith communities too. For many trans people, a key to good care is being encountered at all junctures as a whole person, not a set of hormones and body parts. Awareness of spirituality is awareness of this sense of personhood more broadly, awareness of a sense of future, and for many people, awareness of being part of a universal community. And it's for this reason that in partnership with an NHS gender clinic in England, I'm currently formulating a framework for spiritual care for people undergoing gender transition that aims to understand the implications of spiritual care for broader mental and physical well-being, and which understands individuals as existing in community and developing character in community. But a brief interlude. Some of you have been in classes this quarter whose theme is gender justice and the common good, and I've met some of you in classes this morning. And as you might know, there was some opposition to the invitation issued to me to come and speak as part of this series. And in part, that was because of work I've done in the past, which detractors felt was blasphemous and undermined the family, and because I'm openly supportive of transgender people. But I wonder too whether the title raised red flags for some people, Gendered Theologies and the Common Good, because the term gender, far from being neutral, has become enormously freighted within Roman Catholic circles, particularly in Europe. A recent special issue of the journal Religion and Gender focused on this controversy. Contributors pointed out that for the Vatican, appeals to gender and engagement with critical gender theory are assumed to go hand in hand with critiques of the assumption that binary human sex is natural and universal. Mary Ann Case, writing in that special issue, holds that it was feminist discussions of gender in the 20th century which prompted the development of the notion of complementarity by Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI. And she further argues that complementarity then came to underlie the Vatican's theology and ideology of human sex and sexuality, not just in specifically religious terms, but also legally and politically, as part of its ongoing opposition to same-sex marriage. So Case wants to argue that the Catholic authorities feared that the gender agenda was motivated by a desire to deny the reality and irreducibility of human sexness as male and female. And she cites Benedict XVI's appeal when he was Joseph Ratzinger against the trivialization of sexual specificity that makes every role interchangeable between man and woman. Sex no longer appears to be a determined characteristic as a radical and pristine orientation of the person. This was in opposition to radical feminists, but other contributors to the special issue note that concern about the apparent undermining of sexual essentialism also appears to underlie some Catholic authorities' suspicion of transgender. So, taking all of that into account, in this climate, the assumption might be, and clearly has been for some people, that gendered theologies are of necessity destructive ones. But I'm also interested in the broader title, Gender Justice and the Common Good. Some of you in your classes and broader work have been thinking about and reflecting on what is good for all people and what promotes the kind of people and the kind of culture and society you want to be. There are some transgender people who would consciously align themselves with queer theologies of the kind that have been suspicious of the phenomenon of family values, not least because, as commentators like Mark Jordan and Lee Edelman have commented, Appeals to innocence, such as children, have too often been happy to throw real children under the bus. That's one tactic for rejecting the notion that family can only be understood as a mother, a father, and their biological children. And in fact, one of the things that I do in my most recent book is to explore the idea that actually the Christian tradition is replete with models of family and kinship that are far more diverse than that. And there's space within the tradition for exploring the ways in which Christianity itself actually disrupts family and says that our commitment is to not only our own group or our own tribe, but to all children of God. We all know perfectly well that families can be destructive as well as affirming places, that they can harbour abuse and neglect, that children are often more at risk from their own relatives than from strangers. In his work on the common good and the social order, Gary Dorian has noted that appeals to a common good should not and cannot elide or erase all difference. There will likely remain appeals to good which take into account local circumstances and concepts, and this is appropriate. However, acknowledging this diversity does not in itself do away with any account of ethical normativity. It will still be possible to ask what tends towards justice. So when we explore the common good, we need to ask whether appeals only to binary models of sex and gender are really good for everyone or for any of us. We need to ask whether the endorsement of bodily materiality and specificity that underlines some rejections of the gender agenda goes far enough, or whether in its conscious endorsement of male and female, it unconsciously excludes and pathologizes those whose bodies and identities don't fit either category. This is particularly important given that variations from the statistical norm include not only psychological and emotional, but also physical difference. And so in the next part of my lecture, I want to move on to thinking about the tricky business of what happens when goods seem to collide, in this case, in the care of intersex children. Many parents have to make decisions about their children's medical care and health care when children are too young to give consent for themselves. Parents who don't consider themselves in any way experts on medical matters are likely to defer to the judgment of professionals involved with their child's care, especially in emergency situations where decisions have to be made quickly. But what happens when there's debate over the best path of care, when parental decisions have implications for children's well-being, not just in the immediate future, but throughout their lives, when parents and doctors disagree about care, or when in some situations parents are not the ones best placed to agree to decisions on behalf of their children. Questions like this are brought into particularly sharp focus in the area of intersex. And for those of you not familiar with this terminology, intersex refers to people who are born with atypicalities of their physical sex, such that their bodies can't be classified as male or female. So their genitals, their gonads, their chromosomes, hormones, gametes may vary from those we typically expect to find. So, for example, an intersex person may have an externally female body, they may have a vulva, a clitoris, breasts after puberty. However, they would have internal testes and XY chromosomes rather than XX chromosomes. That would be one example. Other intersex people might have XX, that is female chromosomes, but a large clitoris which looks and functions more like a penis. And some intersex people have a mix of characteristics, some XX cells and some XY cells in the same body, a testis and an ovary, genitalia which don't really look either male or female, but something different. Some people go through most or even all of their lives without ever realizing, for example, that they're genetic mosaics, that is, that they have a mix of XX and XY chromosomes, or some female tissue alongside their male tissue. This might begin to prompt questions for us about how significant physical sex really is as a marker of identity and ontology, if it's not uncommon not even to know about it, and yet to live a perfectly ordinary life. But some differences are, of course, more evident from early on. When infants are born with visibly unusual genital anatomy, parents are likely to be asked to make decisions about their care soon after birth. And what's best for intersex infants is hugely debated, particularly given criticisms since about the middle of the 1990s about early surgeries. Intersex adults and allies have been battling against that since then. Furthermore, decisions made by doctors or parents in the past might be considered to have been detrimental to the long-term goods of the intersex adult. So ethics in this area are about the difficult task of weighing up present and projected goods and deciding which and whose goods should be most closely guarded. Christian theological ethics and theological anthropology contain rich and varied discussions surrounding the moral and the cosmic significance of human sex differentiation. For some commentators following in the footsteps of Thomas Aquinas, for example, or Karl Barth, or Hans Urs von Balthasar, human-sex relationship is synecdoche, like a little mini version, an example of the divine-human relationship. And something of the meaning of being human is found in sex itself, particularly as this tends, and for these writers it tends in male terms, towards generativity, towards reproduction. Barth argued that the way that human females were to follow and to respond to human males echoed the way that all humans were to follow and respond to God. To deny the order and procession built into human sex and gender, Barth believed, would be to deny the broader divine order. The problem with this is that it assumes that a hierarchy of genders simply is natural and indisputable, rather than being a social construction which presents its own problems and might actually prevent women and people with unusual sex-gender configurations from developing relationships with God in their own right. And in contrast, I've wanted to suggest that while to be human is irreducibly to be sexed, human sex does not manifest only along male or female lines, and biological generativity is a frequent but not a universal concomitant. Intersex people's humanity is in no way compromised because their sex is atypical. Rather, intersex is one phenomenon which disrupts the apparent incontrovertibility of clear and binary biological sex as a human characteristic. And I've explored this at greater length in two of my books, as well as the new book I've already mentioned. But another really useful text that I've put up here as well is Megan de Franz's book, Sex Difference in Christian Theology, Male, Female, and Intersex in the Image of God, rooted in her evangelical background, but targeted particularly at a Roman Catholic readership. In the last 2 decades, many intersex activists and other commentators have been vocally critical of the paradigm under which children with atypical genitalia were likely to undergo early corrective surgery, such as the reduction of a large clitoris, the removal of a small penis, or the creation of a vaginal opening. Critics of the early corrective surgery model have argued that unusual genitals are almost never in themselves of any detriment to physical health, and that there's no need to perform surgery in infancy or childhood. And those familiar with this area of ethics will know that at its very heart are tussles over competing goods and questions about whether justice for society at large is best served by early and compulsory medical intervention for children with unusual bodies. Intersex activists and critical theorists have argued that actually secrecy and misinformation surrounding the medical treatment of intersex have been as harmful, if not more harmful, than unusual physical manifestations have been. And from the mainstream medical side, I think another set of goods has been at stake. That is, around intervening to promote normality. The assumption that children need to be clearly sexed and appropriately gendered in order to be happy and normal, and perhaps a suggestion, implicit rather than explicit, that allowing unusually sexed bodies to persist uncorrected is in some way threatening to the good of society at large. Many doctors today still believe that to be happy and well-adjusted, someone must be clearly male or female, and that if there's any question about sex, it's appropriate to tweak the body for the sake of future gender identity. Doctors aren't unique in that respect. We can see similar assumptions in the work of writers like Yarhouse and Roberts, as well as O'Donovan and others. Furthermore, many parents also assume that clear sex is a prerequisite of the normality they want for their children. But increasingly, as we've heard, commentators suggest that risks to psychological well-being which atypical anatomy may cause have been overstated, and that what's more psychologically damaging is undergoing invasive genital surgery, frequent examination and hospitalization, not being told the truth about one's condition, and growing up in a climate of secrecy. Now, doctors who do intervene appeal to a range of goods to justify their intervention. Many continue to believe that early surgery promotes better psychological outcomes later. Others also believe it's necessary for parents to see normal-looking genitals in order to be able to bring up their child without ambivalence. Parental desires for normal children stem, I think, not from selfishness, but from a sincere belief that difference and abnormality often lead to suffering and bullying and are best avoided. Parents are aware that they're not bringing children up in a vacuum, and that not being readily identifiable as a boy or a girl is one of the first things that might make their child vulnerable. What else are they to do but to make decisions which seem as though they'll promote happiness and normality for their child? But even when they're working with a wide range of information, parents may privilege more pressing or immediate goods over more distant or nebulous ones. This is not particularly surprising or sinister. After all, not all parents are conversant with the critical gender theory that's been so prevalent in the intersex discussion. They may not be aware that early surgery has been criticised from so many quarters. They might be ashamed or embarrassed or just bewildered at being told by doctors that they're not sure about their baby's sex. They may feel squeamish thinking about their baby's future sex life. They'll also have other concerns in mind. What might happen to them as a family if their child's unusual body goes uncorrected, or if they don't conceal the uncertainty surrounding their child's sex? In short, parents are likely to make choices which they believe will promote their child's happiness. But the existence of the strongly binary gendered paradigm that we have in Western societies, influenced by Christian theological goods and norms, means that few parents are confident enough to believe that growing up with atypical genitalia or perhaps a non-binary gender identity could promote happiness. Eva Feder-Kitay has argued that a purported desire for normality by parents is actually shorthand for a desire for other goods: safety, comfort, stability. Normality equals desirability. It's a communal good rather than an individual one. Significantly, however, what is considered normal is not fixed. It's likely to shift and alter as social mores do. Additionally, communal goods and individual goods will not always be identical. Kitay argues that excessive conformity is morally repugnant and gives rise to blandness for those who remain within the norm and to isolation for those excluded. So, one tactic for those parents who face having abnormal children, including parents of intersex children, will be to construct new normalities, based, for example, on seeking out other families in similar situations. Importantly, in this way, they don't reject the concept of normality altogether. Indeed, they affirm that it's appropriate and good for normal parents to create safe and supportive environments for their children. But, says Kitay, what they affirm is an altered conception of the norm. The new norms are generated out of a newly constituted habitus, one that emerges under changed conditions of existence and through the formation of a different community. The new community is not distinct from the old, nor are its conditions of existence entirely different. There are continuities and discontinuities. So Christian communities, I want to say, might also be instrumental in promoting new conceptions of belonging and legitimacy, which don't rest only in binary sex norms, particularly given the tradition's long history of endorsing non-kinship relationships, households, and other communities. And one of the things I explore in my new book is the idea that there will be flashes of affinity between the family values often claimed as such and those which embrace more expansive modes, including perhaps same-sex marriage, and that there will be both continuity and discontinuity with more familiar versions of institutions like marriage and family. So one question could be whether and when the goods of promoting family goals might be preferred over goods merely belonging to individual children. Could a family's need for normality and avoiding unwelcome attention override an intersex child's good in having their bodily integrity respected, and the broadest possible range of adult sexual outcomes kept open for them? What family goods might Christian theologians want to claim, where the family is the religious community in which the child is growing up, as well as the immediate biological family, or where the moral community can be understood even more broadly as society at large? As Ross notes, respecting persons includes respecting their potential goods as well as their actual ones. I want to suggest that eschatologically inflected ethics in the context of decision-making on ethical care for intersex infants will mean that future goods are considered alongside present ones. If human goods are constructed as those which anticipate and inaugurate an order beyond binaries and which recognise the importance of provisionality in resisting the maximisation of human ideology, then decision-making for intersex and for broader questions of care will acknowledge persons' future existence in the incoming order, not just their existence within the present one. Taking future goods seriously will usually mean making choices which least limit the future options for the child concerned. Now, we might immediately note there an area of tension between intersex and transgender. After all, some interventions for transgender are also serious and irreversible. Is it not hypocritical to hold that intersex children should have their options kept open as possible if we don't say the same about transgender? Well, a couple of responses to that. First, as I've noted, most people who transition gender and undergo gender confirmation surgery are already well established in their adult lives. And I haven't been talking, and I'm not at all talking today, about the ethics of intervention for children with a transgender identity. That is a whole conversation that we don't have time for today. Suffice to say that irreversible interventions for under 18s remain extremely rare, and that medics tend precisely to advocate delaying making permanent decisions for as long as possible. Young trans people may be offered hormones to delay their puberty in order to give them more time to come to understand the momentous nature of some of their decisions. Furthermore, though, sadly it's the case that not intervening for trans people doesn't always mean in practice more options for their future. In fact, many trans people experience such distress and dysphoria that they self-harm and even take their own lives, such that their future, in this earthly realm at least, is abruptly curtailed. It's here that we do butt up against a continuing area of tension between transgender and intersex. It's indisputable that at least some trans people do inhabit a strongly binary mindset, not challenging the notion that there are men and women and that they're different from each other, but simply holding that they should have been born the other one. By contrast, intersex people and their advocates are far more likely to challenge the binary system all told, holding that sex and gender are more of a continuum than a binary. But in both cases, from a theological anthropological angle, we might want to reflect on how our lives and bodies, as we experience them here and now, relate to our hope and expectation of embodied lives in the age to come. Jürgen Moltmann, the Christian theologian working in Germany, holds that there must be continuity and discontinuity between this age and the age to come in terms of the relationships and social goods currently in operation. The newness that comes about in the eschaton, he says, makes the old order obsolete, but not by annihilating it. Rather, he says, it gathers it up and creates it anew. The eschaton completes the first creation, so that what is remembered is caught up and preserved in hope, and what is past is surpassed in the future. Similarly, for Karl Barth, eschatology anticipates a resurrection in which humans are raised as ourselves. So eschatology involves redemption, not erasure, of what is and has been. Where it's been assumed that deviation from binary male and female is deviation from a divine creational norm, it may be assumed that such redemption would involve healing intersex bodies, and that medical interventions in this life might be considered an anticipation of such healing. There are theologians who make exactly that argument. But in the affirmation that what we see now is not all that is, we need perhaps to re-examine assumptions about what makes good or healthy bodies. Intervention to correct unusual sex may limit possibility not just for this specific body, but for human bodies in general. This is why it's so important that we're beginning to hear from intersex adults, not only about their critiques of early corrective surgery, but also about their experiences of spirituality and self-understanding of their bodies as sites of divine revelation. I've drawn on interviews with intersex Christians in some of my own work, who appeal, for example, to the belief that God made them and wove them together in their mother's womb, in the words of Psalm 139, and felt that there must be a bigger purpose, that this was happening within God's plan and God's intention. Spiritual care for this population means taking seriously these body stories without dismissing them as more fallen or further from God's intention than others. But there continue to exist accounts which call this into question and hold that intersex somehow contradicts the orders of creation. Several intersex Christians from whom I've heard in the last few weeks are deeply dismayed by the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood's Nashville Statement on human sex, gender and sexuality, since while at first sight this appears to acknowledge the existence of intersex in non-condemnatory fashion, reading between the lines, it actually appears to do the opposite and to mandate surgical intervention to clarify binary sex. So in the context of decision-making about intersex infants' care and promotion of the common good, An important question is what kind of persons the community wishes to cultivate. What are the virtues and qualities the Christian community wishes doctors, parents, and we ourselves, whether we're intersex people or others invested in promoting intersex goods, to have? How might such virtues be endorsed or elided in given care pathways, including spiritual care? What are the family goods of the Christian church? For many Christian ethicists, wisdom and virtue have been understood as participation in bringing about God's new order. Christians might judiciously be circumspect about assuming that the fulfillment of a divine intent for human sex in creation necessarily entails the endorsement and maintenance only of binary sex and gender as goods. If inaugurated eschatology entails the inbreaking of the world to come, living prophetically may mean challenging the order of things. These principles chime with more mainstream accounts of the new creation. For John Zizioulas, for example, eschatology profoundly entails reconciliation, and the activity of the church on earth are foretastes of it. The church may be figured then as a place where reconciliation is imagined and difference celebrated. Reconciliation will not necessarily mean erasure of difference, but, as in Theologies of Disability, transformation of its significance. Zizioulas describes a communion of all things overcoming our presently mutually antagonistic communions. If virtue is the education of character in community, then for the church, Eucharist is a mean by which this occurs. Christians are schooled in the necessity of the acknowledgement of the equality of embodied experience before God. If eschatological resurrection bodies are not necessarily figured as binary sexed, then removing uncertainty and constructing a semblance of binary sex now need not be the best or only way to inscribe legitimacy in the just future we're helping to build. The account with which I opened, that of the vision of the NHS at its construction, is one powerful account, but as I said, not an unchallenged one, and one which raises as many questions as answers about the necessary bounds of the community. And that tension is repeated in dilemmas about how to squeeze good spiritual care into a creaking system, and how to negotiate whose goods are paramount. Yet, as Gary Dorian notes, recognising conflicting and competing accounts doesn't mean giving up on the possibility of a just common future. We can appeal to a common good because we are of a common kind. We're of the same genus, we are all human kin. We share the same genre, yet genre can be limiting as well as democratising. It can be genericizing, it can be stultifying. And it's here I begin the discussion in my new book, holding that each new human is both entirely a product of their culture and history, and entirely something new with the potential to generate. For this reason, as humans, we're not condemned to repeat or reinforce what's been passed down to us. We shape it just as it has shaped us. Accounts of marriage, family, health, well-being, and the good. None of these is immaculate or unchanging. Rather, they develop over time and in conversation with historic and contemporary traditions. And it's in and through mutual relationship between the people formed by institutions and the institutions formed by people that Christians create and recreate their faith. So one of the things we've considered today as I draw to a close is that sex and gender don't always seem to match in typical ways, even at a biological level. Transgender and intersex show that sex and gender may not always be as straightforward as they seem. Should they then be understood as anomalies, which don't fundamentally disrupt the model of there being two distinct and separate human genders, which map onto two distinct and separate human sexes as God intended? Or alternatively, should the existence of transgender and intersex prompt theologians to re-examine their theological anthropologies and ask whether theologies which assume a fixed binary model of maleness and femaleness continue to make sense in light of what we now know of human sex and gender? Theologies which assume maleness and femaleness can't easily accommodate hard cases. But if intersex and transgender are not just exceptions to the rule, but actually mean that Christians should re-examine their whole understanding of sex and gender, asking what constitutes a common good that is good for these embodied, divinely made, and God-imaging people too, will be central to our project. While heterosexual norms might have been convenient bedfellows for Christianity at certain places and times in its history, its conflation with them must be resisted. Only by retelling and reclaiming lost stories about multiple genders, identities, bodies, and lives can God's own lack of annexability be emphasized. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Cornwell, for a marvelous presentation, and my thanks as well to Dorian and Teresa for the opportunity to have this terribly important conversation. I want to remind you, if you're filling out questions on your cards, please do so now, and they will be gathered so we can address some of those questions at the end. In her novel, Beloved, Toni Morrison writes of her people, "Love your hands. Love them, raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them, pat them together, stroke them on your face. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here, flesh that needs to be loved." But love, such love we know is a hard grace. Flesh that is love, love embodied. And so I think we must proceed with great care and even reverence in what we say, for it is flesh we're talking about here. The most intimate aspects of what Kierkegaard calls our own most selves. And I'm grateful to Professor Cornwell for her wise and challenging words. Grateful, too, that here at Santa Clara we can discuss such contentious questions with the respect such questions demand. For the issues are indeed contentious. In his apostolic exhortation, Amoris Laetitia, Pope Francis invokes traditional precepts of natural law in opposing gender transitioning. And yet the Pope is notable in his advocacy of mercy and the pastoral embrace of members of the LGBT community. My brief remarks this evening, I want to draw upon a largely untapped resource in the Catholic Church's teaching on sexuality, that is the rich heritage of the Church's teaching on the common good that might, I believe, offer some prospect of rapprochement. At the heart of modern Roman Catholic moral theology in all of its branches is a recognition of and respect for the fundamental dignity of every person, created in the image of God, the Imago Dei. The dignity of moral persons is a motif running throughout the history of our discipline, even prior to its emergence as a distinct field. For Thomas Aquinas, we bear the image of God as moral agents participating in God's loving care for all creation. The natural law is our imperfect participation in God's eternal law. But only in the modern period does dignity emerge as the key hermeneutical principle, a leitmotif in the Church's moral teaching. In the wake of the Holocaust, the Shoah, John XXIII's encyclical Pacem in Terris, 1963, adopts the discourse of dignity as the ground of equal human rights. Faith in dignity and human rights affirmed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 is now embraced. And 2 years later, the doctrine of religious liberty is fully recognized. We see in these moves or gambits, I think, a significant hermeneutical or interpretive shift. In the scholastic and neo-scholastic teaching, dignity was interpreted or inscribed, we might say, within the context of a rich metaphysical hierarchy defining the end of the common good. And it led ultimately to salvation. The perfect community comprised a multi-status hierarchy of roles and rights determined in part by sex, or as we would say today, gender. Women, for Aquinas, for instance, were in a natural state of subjection, incapable of exercising full public virtue. Now, it's the reversal of this hermeneutic flow that marks the Church in our modern world. Henceforth, the equal dignity of persons, guaranteed in a regime of equal basic rights and correlative duties, becomes the decisive moral principle. Dignity signifies that persons, as persons, are irreducibly valuable, possessed of intrinsic and absolute worth, whatever their full conceptions of the good or notions of perfection might be. The dignity of persons obtains independently of properties distinguishing them, race, ethnicity, or gender, and is given prior to any legislative enactment or judicial decision. As Kant reminds us, persons have worth, not price. In no circumstances can someone cease to matter. Now, recognition of and respect for people's equal dignity implies, as the philosopher Bernard Williams once said, that persons should be regarded from the human point of view. Each is owed an effort at identification. She should not be regarded as the surface to which a certain label can be applied, but rather we should try to see the world from her point of view. Moreover, such extreme degradation, says Williams, may distort an agent's consciousness of her own activities. We evidently need something more, a precept that one may not suppress or destroy that consciousness. Now, the implications of dignity are rich and complex for our understanding of sexuality, and I can only touch on them here. First, the Church's interventions in the public order are no longer governed by a perfectionist teleology that is ordered to a single metaphysical common good. Rather, as John the 23rd argues, the common good today will be realized in modern, pluralist societies like our own, in establishing a basic rights regime preserving the dignity of all, including persons' rights to effective participation. No longer can distinctive religious beliefs be imposed under the banner of establishment. And one implication of this hermeneutical shift is that respect for persons' dignity and equal rights raises serious questions about legislative or juridical discrimination on the basis of sex or gender. Dignity is not heteronormative. To say so is a category mistake. As Professor Cornwell argues, intersex people's humanity is in no sense compromised because their sex is atypical. Now, the modern primacy of dignity does not preclude our distinctive religious beliefs, nor need we bracket them even in our public discourse. It is, after all, religious belief that for many of us undergirds our recognition of dignity, our creation in the imago Dei, the image of God. But religious appeals to classical teleology, hierarchical role differentiation, or gender complementarity must be rendered consistent with the primacy accorded equal dignity. John Paul, for instance, rejects the scholastic notion that women are in a state of natural subjection. For the first time, he declares slavery intrinsically evil. Now, this brings us to the questions that Professor Cornwell has so ably addressed, and here I must be very brief. But the implications of what I call the hermeneutical shift are significant. First, the ascription of dignity raises into question a sharp binary distinction of natural kinds, male and female, and the corollary, binary opposition of nature as sexed and culture as gendered. Dignity is proper to persons as embodied moral agents, where embodiment signifies the complex personal integration of biology, environment, and culture. The pertinent distinction here, then, is not nature as given and culture as constructed, but rather embodiment or embodied becoming and freedom. We may indeed, I think, even speak of a hermeneutics of embodiment ranging over a child's assigned or natal gender to mature gender identity. Such a gambit avoids the twin extremes of an uncritical naturalism, where biological anatomy exhausts gender, or an equally uncritical existentialism, where gender is reduced to mere preference, leading, in Cardinal Ratzinger's words, to the trivialization of sexual specificity. Rather, freedom is embodied, and we must ask how embodiment configures choice. I think the key word here is ask. For to acknowledge that biological endowment of sex is, in Ratzinger's words, a determined characteristic, that this is morally relevant, is not, I think, to say that it is necessarily decisive. As Stephen Rosenthal observes, compelling studies have demonstrated that gender identity is not simply a psychosocial construct, but likely reflects a complex interplay of biologic, environmental, and cultural factors. Respect for embodied intersex and transgendered persons implies then that they are owed an effort at identification. They should not be regarded as the surface to which a certain label can be applied, pathological, but we should try to see the world from their point of view. Neither can we suppress or destroy that consciousness of their own activities, gender dysphoria. Indeed, equal respect and consideration enjoin preferential care, including affirming pastoral care for those whose equal rights are unequally threatened or imperiled, an option for the poor or systemically vulnerable, among whom we must certainly include intersex and transgendered people whose stories, Professor Cornwell reminds us, are so often lost. We have, I think, much to learn, and we need not fear such an inquiry. In looking ahead, we might even look back and take some instruction from Thomas Aquinas. For while Thomas's 13th century biology is primitive by our standards, his sexual morality is not entirely physicalist, as some critics would contend. Thomas does not simply infer principles of natural law from the structure of the sexual act. Rather, he looks to the characteristic inclination of procreation and rearing shared by persons and animals alike. For him, what was given in the inclination to procreation was straightforward and heteronormative. Today, though, our view is necessarily more complex. Nature does not speak unequivocally, but as we argued in the complex process of embodiment, gender identity, writes Rosenthal, can only be assumed and not in fact known until an individual achieves a particular level of psychological development and self-awareness. In a sense, I think what nature gives us is a task, integral embodiment in freedom rather than simply a recipe. And I conclude, in all too brief theological postscript, embodied freedom is at the heart of Karl Rahner's transcendental theology. What is demanded in love, finally, is not this or that deed, but one's very self. In the words of Rahner, it's one of his few lyrical passages. One is oneself demanded, oneself staked in the concreteness of her heart, of her lying still before her as an unknown future, and revealing once it has been accomplished and only then, what is this heart which had to wager and expend itself during this life? For Rahner, what distinguishes us as persons, indeed what constitutes our very nature as persons, is this embodied freedom. The choice before God of bodily integrity is just what nature requires. Now, what this means for our subject today is, at least for me, not fully resolved. For instance, the wisdom of invasive genital surgery for intersex children. But framing our inquiry in terms of embodiment and freedom is, I think, a first step. I am grateful so much to Professor Cornwall for taking us there. For flesh is what we are talking about, flesh that needs to be loved. Thank you. So we have time for a few questions, and I'm going to ask the first, but first to give Professor Cornwall a chance to rebut anything I've said. So, please.
I've no rebuttals. That was a lovely response, and thank you for foregrounding dignity so much in there, and for bringing us back to the question of integrity. And I think often it comes to the fore in these discussions that people on all sides want to uphold those as goods, and then it's the difficult question of manifestation. But to hold those as irreducible principles is so crucial.
Yes. Thank you. And here are some questions that we'll try to compile. If at a very practical level, if we want to move beyond binary ideas of sexuality, what do we do about pronouns for people and for God? Our language can shape our thought, and this seems important.
Thank you for the question. I don't know who asked it, so thank you, all of you, communally. It's actually one of the questions that first kind of prompted me on this kind of inquiry. There have been some really pragmatic solutions suggested. So some of you might have come across alternative gender pronoun systems where there are neutral gender pronouns. Some would advocate using those for people who identify only as non-binary, and others would say, maybe we should do away with gendered pronouns altogether and simply all use gender-neutral pronouns. There are rarely situations in which we need to know the sex of someone as they're walking into a room in a story. The case for using those pronouns for God, I've heard some people advocate that, and to say, actually, one of the, I suppose, shortcomings of the English language thus far is we've only had a non-personal gender-neutral it, and it doesn't seem right to talk about God in those terms, because it kind of overrides the idea of God as personal and relational and so on. I've heard people experiment with addressing God the Father and God the Son as He, and the Holy Spirit as she. I think in all of these questions, what they remind us of, regardless of what we conclude, is that any language we use for God that appeals to images like father is metaphorical language. Yes, yeah. God is not a father as human fathers are fathers. There are aspects of human fatherhood that can teach us something about God's fatherhood, but God's fatherhood exceeds those things. So while it might feel uncomfortable to use a gender-neutral pronoun like Z, for example, in reference to God, there might be an argument for saying that strangeness is important if it reminds us that we can't domesticate God.
Yes, thank you. And a second question, have other faiths provided promising paths to spiritual care for transgender intersex persons?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's some really great work, important work going on among Jewish communities in particular at the moment, including here in California, which some of you might have come across. I think one of the reasons why traditionally the Christian tradition has perhaps responded less well to this stuff than Judaism and Islam is because we've had relatively few instances within Christianity where someone can only perform a particular religious duty. If they're of a certain sex, priesthood would be an exception historically. But yeah, if we look at the historical tradition, Islamic jurists were talking about this stuff in the 8th century, and Jewish scholars from a long time before. The rabbis kind of discuss this stuff a lot. And there are, in the ancient texts, there seems to be recognition that there are more categories than just male or female that naturally arise and that are not problematic in their own right, but might create challenges for issues around ritual bathing, burial, inheritance, and that kind of thing. So this might seem like a very kind of modern innovation, and actually there have been discussions in those faiths for a long time. I think one of the things that's interesting when we're thinking about contemporary responses and spiritual responses is the ways in which the faiths are working together.
Yes.
And partly that's because healthcare chaplaincy tends to be very interfaith and multi-faith, and because of the conviction that it's not just for people of faith, it's for anyone of any faith or no faith. So it makes sense for the faiths to be working together on that.
Oh, thank you. And the next question really follows from that, Professor Cornwall, and that is, can you speak to what your research participants, where they find their primary sources of support? A question similar to what I was going to ask you about the pastoral care for those who are transitioning. What are the best practices? What are the sources of support? And do we join a larger conversation in the United States or in Britain that would help frame or provide the context for that?
Yeah, there are some great innovations in trans-spiritual care happening in the US in particular, and there are collectives which are coming together to provide support, but also formulating liturgies and prayers, ceremonies for marking transition and that kind of thing. And we've had discussions recently in Britain about whether the Church of England should provide specific liturgy for gender transition. In terms of spiritual care and where people find support, what I found in my research with intersex Christians in particular was that by and large they were able to find typical congregations. It could be a Catholic congregation, it could be a Methodist congregation. It wasn't just what you might expect would be particularly open or liberal denominations like the MCC, for example. But it was to do with individual congregations. It was to do with individual ministers or chaplains. And on the one hand, I found that very heartening. And on the other hand, I thought the problem with that is that it leaves good pastoral care to be a matter of good luck in terms of who you meet and whether they're compassionate or not. And I thought it's a problem if what's going on in local congregations, which by and large was quite positive, doesn't quite match up with what the hierarchy of a denomination is saying or not saying. So support groups were a really important source of solidarity. In Britain, we have groups like Sibyl's, which is a transgender spirituality group. But I think it's a both-and approach. It's kind of local peer support groups, but also I think what a denomination or what a faith group has as its official teaching matters. It matters symbolically, as well as in terms of the power that has over people's lives.
Yes, thank you. And this is a question, what sparked your interest in the spiritual care of transgendered intersex persons? Maybe a biographical question.
So
your story.
People often ask whether I'm intersex or have an intersex child, and the answer is no to both of those. I came across, before I started my PhD, I came across writings by people from the intersex activism movement, which were criticizing early corrective surgery from the point of view of kind of feminist politics, really, critiquing the assumptions that had been made on their behalf that the reason why they needed to have surgical intervention was in order that when they grew up they'd be able to have sexual intercourse, that would be penetrative, that if they were a woman that would be with men. and people who were very upset about those assumptions being imposed on them by doctors and parents. And it was the first that I had kind of heard of intersex, and I immediately wondered what's been done on this theologically, because I immediately began thinking, what are the implications for theologies which set a lot of store on the way that male-female relationships mirror or image the relationships between God and humanity. And I'd had an existing interest in eschatology and in theologies of bodily resurrection, so I began to wonder about that and what the implications would be for life in the new creation. So that was how I began the research. And in Britain, our PhDs are much shorter than yours here. So while I would have loved to do some of the empirical stuff in my PhD, there wasn't space. And so that became the next project where I went to interview intersex Christians about their experiences of faith. I came to transgender because at the time I started my research, there was very, very little written theologically on intersex. And one of the things, at least, that a PhD is a contribution to an existing discussion rather than something completely out of left field. So I wondered to what extent it was helpful to build on or borrow from transgender theologies, given that there has sometimes been some animosity and tension between trans and intersex people.
Yes. Yeah. And a question and this is a broad question, but it bears on our topic. How would you understand gender justice? This is our last question. I'm sorry, I didn't see you there. Teresa,
just a nice small question to end with.
Yeah, a simple question just to conclude with here.
Thank you.
But maybe a question you might leave us with. Yeah.
I think I will, actually.
Good.
I think I'll leave it there and hand back to Teresa. Thank you very much.
Will project as there we go. Hello. Thank you. I'm just extending gratitude on behalf of everyone here for your contributions today and for opening up these frames and dialogue. This month marks the 20th anniversary of the pastoral document, Always Our Children, that was offered by the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops to families in the LGBT community. And so we hope that, and I firmly hold that today's contribution will continue the work of such pastoral extension. So thank you. And a few announcements. First, your evaluations. As we develop the work of the institutes, we really value your feedback for topics and questions that you would like to see explored. So if you can share some of your feedback from today, that's very valuable to us. Second, today's event is a featured public lecture for our Gender Justice and the Common Good Faculty Collaborative. So it's comprised of 6 faculty who are here with us today from disciplines across the university, working together around research and teaching gender justice and the common good. And we're going to be following this up with a roundtable dialogue on November 8th in the Williman Room. So we invite you to come and continue the conversation there. There's more information on our Ignatian Center website. And also, if you can check out the Bannon Institute's podcast, Integral. We're in our 3rd season, and we feature the contributions from our faculty contributors in the Gender Justice and the Common Good Collaborative. So you can access that through our Ignatian Center website, as well as through all the standard podcast forms. So for now, I thank you all very much for coming and ask you to help me thank our distinguished speakers once more.